Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Petrak. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. And I'm very excited about today's guest, the brilliant and charismatic Mark Froelich. Now, before we hear from Mark, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction. He's a Harvard-trained medical oncologist. And over the last 25 years, he's really made a name for himself as the leading drug developer in cellular therapies in immuno-oncology. He was the chief medical officer at Dendreon, the first IO company. He was the head of R&D at Juno in the CAR-T space. And now he's the CEO of Indapta, developing an allogeneic NK cell therapy. So Mark Froelich, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Now, the first time I heard your name, I was recruiting for Dendreon. And now you guys are considered among the pioneers in the IO space. Did you know that at the time?
Well, we knew we were tackling uncharted territory. Obviously, I think at that time, there were believers and non-believers in immunotherapy. And I think that's hard for people, even now, just 20 years later, to kind of fully appreciate that was the case. And so like when we were, having discussions with, physicians, urologists, medical oncologists, there was a lot of time spent trying to explain the basics of the immune system and how it works and how a therapy like this might be able to benefit their patients.
I see. And it seems like everywhere you go, Dendreon, Juno, Indapta, you're on the cutting edge of technology. And when you're working with pioneering technologies, it's got to come with challenges and obstacles. So what are some of those?
I think, the biggest challenge was with Dendreon because it was the first, immunotherapy and cellular therapy approved by the FDA. And the challenges were really, multifactorial. It was a fresh product, both in the front and the back end, that made it really hard to fully load a manufacturing facility. The mechanism of action wasn't really well documented, made it challenging physicians to understand it, and made process improvements, like automation with the FDA challenging because it wasn't really clear what the critical quality attributes were. There was, lack of immediate tumor response. So it made it hard for the individual physician and patient to kind of know that the treatment was working. There was the lack of understanding about the immune system, as I noted, and then a perception that it was, highly priced, and that led to the Center for Medicare Services, doing this evaluation on whether to pay for it. So, we could talk about this all afternoon, but maybe, just a few takeaways that I hearken back to, ever since then when I think about drugs are, for cell therapies, needs to be cryopreserved to be really commercially viable, need to understand and document the mechanisms of action early in development with really intensive translational research. I think for cell therapy, given the logistics and the cost, we need to set the bar high. We need to see responses and they need to be durable. And then once you get to clinical proof of concept, I think educating payers about the merits of the therapy and the value of the therapy, those are all really critical.
Man, those are really valuable nuggets. Thank you for that. And, I know we were looking backwards at Dendreon. Now I want to look forwards. With the IO space rapidly changing, new breakthroughs, new findings, what do you see on the horizon, let's say in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, first I'd like to say that it's just an incredibly exciting time to be in, oncology and specifically immuno-oncology. When I trained back in the early 90s, clinical research really consisted of kind of mixing and matching chemotherapies with the hope of extending survival by a few weeks or months. And just within my career, and I could see this, anticipate this might happen, which is kind of why I went into oncology. We've seen just these amazing improvements where now immunotherapy is really part of the standard of care of almost every therapy. We're seeing, plateaus and survival curves with new therapies like CAR-T that suggest that maybe, a percentage of these patients are getting cured. And the scientific tools that we have at our disposal, are so much more powerful that we can start asking questions that weren't even conceivable just a few years ago. But we have a lot of challenges, so, how are we going to get more tumor types to respond? How are we going to get more patients within a given tumor type to respond? Why do people stop responding, and what can we do about that? And I think that within my career and lifetime, we're going to really start cracking that nut. And, I don't know which technology or which approach, is going to be the most successful, but I'm encouraged that that the field in general is trying so many different approaches. And I think ultimately to get to those long-term remissions or cures, it's probably going to be integrating, several of these to make them happen. My bias is that cell therapy, is going to be an important part of that. New cell types like natural killer cells that we're working on, in addition to T cells that have been incredibly successful. And then finally applying, artificial intelligence to, the design of new molecules, interpretation of clinical data, and clinical trial design, I think are going to be major factors in the next 10 years.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, especially when you start thinking about the AI component and how that's in its infancy and where will that be in 10 to 15 years. We might not even be able to conceive of that. And you spoke a little bit about your training, and I wanted I just find it really fascinating. Your undergraduate work and postgraduate work was in electrical and computer engineering. And then you took a totally different turn and went to medical school.
Yeah.
So tell us about that pivotal decision.
It's true. It was a little bit of a leap of faith for me. I come from a family of engineers, and nobody was in medicine. But I actually applied to a program called Health Science and Technology, which is a joint venture between Harvard and MIT, which is very research focused. And so my plan going into it was that I was going to apply engineering, to medical problems. But when I got to medical school, I ended up joining a biology lab, and I really got focused on cancer research, and I really got seduced by the mystery and the beauty of biology. And so I ended up focusing on that in medical school, and then ended up doing an oncology fellowship after internal medicine and spending a fair amount of time in the lab kind of understanding and working on oncology.
From a family of engineers, every child that wants to go to medical school, it's like a celebration. In your family, was that like, what do you mean you're not going to be an engineer?
Yeah, I always joke, like when my father is talking to my son, it was like, so Sam, what kind of an engineer do you think you want to be? So
yeah, it's strange that the medical doctor is the black sheep of the family, but that's no, I'm sure they're very proud. And but when you look back on your career, a lot of people that when they look back, they tend to see that, oh, this piece of my career and this piece of my career, they all marry into this unique skill set. And I'm sure the same could be said about you. How has that engineering background helped you in drug development?
I think engineering is really about, identifying a problem and then coming up with a solution by breaking it down into components, kind of figuring out a solution to each part of those, and then kind of integrating them together. And that's really very similar, to drug development. We're always evaluating basic science discoveries coming out of academia or technologies that are happening, that are being developed at other companies, and figuring out does that apply to what we're doing? Can we license that, bring it in and make it part of, the bigger picture of what we're working on. The whole field of synthetic biology is really very much an engineering problem. It's, introducing, switches, receptors, logic gates into cells and using biological mechanisms instead of transistors to kind of build it together. So, certainly aspects of drug development are very much engineering problems.
That is fascinating. Yeah, good illustration. When you think about, tackling an engineering problem, with math and things that are really fixed and always right, and then, working in drug development where you're trying to figure out how the pieces all work, and now you're leading a company where you're dealing with human beings, that there's not always a right answer. That's got to be a big change. What has been the biggest change for you as CEO?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge as a CEO is that you're responsible for everything, right? And so as a chief medical officer or head of R&D, I certainly had a lot of responsibility, but it didn't include things like finance, manufacturing, process development, business development, human resources. And so to make sure we're making the right decisions in those areas, I think first hiring the right people, whether as employees or consultants is really mission critical. But even that isn't enough, right? You always need to be pressure testing. If we screw up in one of those areas, I don't get a pass from my board saying, by casting blame at the head of that group, right? The buck stops with me. And so I ask a lot of questions, until I can get comfortable that the team is being very thorough and thoughtful. And over time, trust builds, and I don't dig as deep, on every recommendation. But I think that's really true, leading any function. But I think it's especially true for the CEO because oftentimes many of those domains are outside of or further away from your core expertise. And so I think it's really getting comfortable about how to approach decision making in areas you're not a domain expert, and that often means relying and just trying to be thoughtful about asking the right questions.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points because some of the other CEOs I've mentioned that are in their second CEO position, one of the biggest things they say is the mistake they made early on is diving too deep in all these different functional areas, getting too involved and not trusting the people they hire.
Yep.
So, but when you're leading a company, you're leading a department, or you're leading a team, leadership is leadership. So on the topic of leadership, which is the point of the Pharmaverse podcast, is what are the 2 or 3 top leadership best practices that you use and you would advise others to?
I think first for me is really to focus spending your time on those tasks that only you can do. There was a book that came out a couple years ago written by 3 McKinsey senior partners called CEO Best Practices, where they interviewed a bunch of CEOs. And one of the pearls from that was exactly this, that you should focus on those things that really only you can do the best. And so it's really easy, to your prior point, to default, for me, digging into protocol, clinical trial design or protocol development or experimental design, right? But the truth is that my chief medical officer, my chief science officer can do that as well and probably actually better than I can do it, right? And so since we don't have an R&D, for me, that's like, well, how can I integrate, the translational insights and science with, the clinical, how does that inform clinical drug development, the clinical trial that we're running? Where are the real value drivers for our company based on my discussions with the board and investors, and so how do we make sure we're allocating our resources to really maximize the value that we're trying to create in the company? And those are the things that the CEO is really best positioned to do. And so just making sure that that's where you're spending most of your time, I think, is not trivial, but very important. One of the second, I think, pearls for me is a value that we came up with at a prior company I worked at when we were doing a mission vision values, is to speak the kind truth. And so by that, I mean really giving honest and direct feedback to your people with the goal of helping them, perform at their best. Earlier in my career, I was really terrible at this, right? I was always, afraid to offend. And so I would often take on these roles myself rather than, empower other people to do it. But if you want, I think it's very clear that if you want people to perform at their best, they need this feedback, right? And if you view that feedback as a gift to them so that they can be the best that they can be, all of a sudden you become eager to give it as opposed to hesitant to give it. And I think if it really comes from a place of love for your employee and wanting them to be the best that they can be, that generally becomes very clear and apparent to your employee, and it ends up being well received. And then finally, I would say, is to ask for feedback. And I think even as a CEOs, we need feedback from our board, from the rest of our executive committee, and how we're perceived, at the whole rest of the company. And despite what I said before, I think many people are hesitant, to give feedback. And so if you appreciate that for you to be at your best, you need more of that feedback more frequently and better and honest and transparent, make a point of asking for it, right? With your boss, like if you sit down once a week at the end of that, at the beginning, like, hey, I've been working on this. You observed me in a couple of meetings. How am I doing? Am I doing better? Am I working at this? Any feedback for me, right? And I think if you do that in a very disciplined way, you're going to get better faster, and people are going to respect you more for having, the integrity and honesty, for, being very transparent, what you're good about, what you're good at, and what you need to work on.
Yeah, I love those. Those are great nuggets. Thank you for sharing those. And you brought up that book early on, the McKinsey book. Are there other leadership books that you've gotten a lot out of?
There are. I can't, none that I can come to mind right now. I'd say, a really important thing that I went through relatively early in my career was a 360, right? Yeah. And that was incredibly liberating for me because I appreciated finally that all those weaknesses I was very aware of and was trying feverishly to hide and make up for with my strength were visible, plainly visible to everybody else in the company, above, same level, and below me. And when you recognize that, and when you just make a decision that you want to address those, and go to your boss and your peers and say, like, I'm working on this, and I want your help, and I want your feedback. All of a sudden, you feel like you're all stroking together, and people are helping you work on your weaknesses. And for me, that was incredibly liberating.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of books, I mean, the book on yourself, that 360 review that you're reading, it can be painful to read, but it is the truth, and it really can be a stepping stone to development. We had another CEO on that talked about how that 360 review really catapulted him to a new level. So those are powerful. And some of the people in our audience are trying to strategize on how to manage their careers. Some are maybe individual contributors that would love to move up to a CMO position or CEO position one day. Are there any words of wisdom that you would share about career management?
First, I would say be intentional about your career development if you can. Like, if you know where you want to go, you're just much more likely to get there, right? But that's important, because if you know where you want to go, and then you're honest and self-reflective, you're going to find there's areas that you need to work on and you need to build on. And so rather than that next career move being to build on what you're already good at, right, which may be the most comfortable thing to do, you may actually choose to pivot and move in a direction that makes you very uncomfortable, because it's not something you've done before or skilled at, but you need that skill to get where you're going, right? And so I think that intentionality about where you're going to go often helps you accelerate your career development. And to make that happen, I think one of the things that's incredibly important is to seek out mentors, right? And this can be hard, because sometimes your boss may not be a great mentor, but try to find someone else in your organization, maybe even someone one or two levels up from you, or even in a different organization. And I think you'll be surprised at how willing people are to share their time if somebody sincerely, is trying to work on getting better. And advise and guide you. And again, I think you're more likely to get where you want to get if you have somebody giving you that kind of honest and transparent advice.
Yeah, let me pull on that string, if you don't mind, about mentors. When someone's the CEO and they've been the CMO and had a career like yours, they may not think that there's someone that can mentor you. Any learnings that you've gleaned from mentors over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I'm so emphatic about that last one is I don't think I did a particularly good job at that, and I think I have learned from CEOs that I worked for before and try to pull, the best aspects of all of those and kind of create my own individual leadership style. But it's something I think I really enjoy the CEO role much more even than I thought I would. And I wish I had made that transition earlier in my career. And I think if I had followed my own advice that I just gave you, I think maybe I would have gotten there more quickly.
Interesting. Well, Mark, that is all the time we have, but I've really benefited from this. I'm sure everybody in oncology listening has certainly benefited from it. So I sincerely thank you for your time and your insights. And thank you so much for being a guest on the Pharmaverse.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. Very fun.
All right, thanks. Well, there are many more great guests lined up, so please stay tuned. See you next time on the Pharmaverse.